Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our multi-cloud live stream. We are excited to have Shannon here from Microsoft. And just as a reminder for everyone, if you are joining us, that these are taking place every Tuesday and Thursday, with the exception of next week as we have VMworld. So make sure you're registered and signed up for that. But please, feel free if you're not able to join live that you can check out all of our recordings on demand on the VMware Cloud YouTube channel. So as I said, we're excited here to have Shannon with David and me. Shannon, do you just want to introduce yourself? And
Sure.
yeah.
Sure. So I'm Shannon Keene. I am a senior cloud advocate at Microsoft. And prior to this role, I did a lot of cloud architecture work. So I've been sort of full-time Azure, but prior to Azure, I was heavy on the VMware front. So when this job opportunity came around to sort of be that audience community engagement kind of point person for Azure VMware Solution, I raised my hand and I have just loved talking about this service ever since. So I've been in this role since March of last year. And of course, things are weird, so I haven't had a chance to travel yet with the role. But I like to do these sort of things as well, just because it gets a chance to have me, show up with the community and engage with the community, because it's one of our big charters on our team.
Cool. So good to have you.
Awesome.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, and just a final thing before we let you take it away is if anyone is watching, please let us know where you're watching from and feel free to jump in and ask any questions in the chat and we'll be sure to address those during the call. All right, Shannon, we'll let you take it from here.
Perfect. So I am going to start by talking about Azure VMware Solution, right? So kind of probably blows your mind, the idea of running VMware workloads in Azure. It did the same thing for me. So if you think about it, you've got your on-premises data center, you've got your vCenter environment, you're running vSphere, you've got vSAN in theory, not always, but a lot of companies wind up gravitating towards vSAN. And then you've got NSX. You'll connect that environment into Azure directly. And the recommended pattern is to use your own express route circuit, which if you're not familiar, that's just like a direct connection into Azure. It's your own fiber connection into the Azure network. You'll deploy the software-defined data center inside of Azure, and you'll get the same corresponding environment. You'll get vCenter, vSAN, vSphere, NSX. And then we have capacity now to run Site Recovery Manager, or SRM. So if you aren't yet thinking about a migration pattern and you might be thinking about this from a disaster recovery perspective, we've got you covered. So you can run Site Recovery Manager on premises and have your target site be Azure VMware Solution. The environment itself gets deployed on bare metal hyperconverged nodes. They are your servers. They aren't logically separate like a lot of cloud services. The only way that the management network of Azure VMware Solution knows how to talk to Azure is connecting it into the Azure Backbone network. And once you connect it into the Azure Backbone network, and you're doing that with an express route circuit. So the deployment, you get your bare metal nodes and an express route circuit, you connect that into an Azure VNet, and then you get access to all of these great services, right? So Azure Active Directory, you can onboard and integrate. You can integrate with Azure Security Center, Azure Sentinel. You can think about building out deployments with Application Gateway. That's hard to do if your environment's living on premises. You can integrate with Azure SQL Database and things like Azure Monitor. So it's sort of like, and I joke a lot, it's like achievement unlocked, right? You get your environment closer to the Azure Resource Manager APIs, and you can bring about better solutions, or at least you can think about cloud native solutions that sort of extend what you're doing on premises into Azure. Now, if you followed the journey of Azure VMware Solution, we had a first go round of Azure VMware Solution. It was Azure VMware Solution by Cloud Simple. They didn't have as many regional availability points, right? So if you followed that version, kind of walked through what GA'd last year, and you're looking at this map, we've got regional coverage over the globe. And I think this will continue to evolve. So the planned regions show up on our Azure products by region. Note that the availability could slip, right? There's some tentative dates that have been placed there. But if you're looking at this and you're noting where you are in the world, in theory, you could deploy Azure VMware Solution in a number of different environments and you'd be covered. So more regions are in the planning stages as well as different clouds. So stay tuned. And I had it on my very first slide, but connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter. That way, You can follow any great announcements. You can ask me questions if you don't feel comfortable asking them today. People are definitely kind of a mixed bag in terms of what they feel comfortable with. So connect with me there, and hopefully, there's a region that comes online that works for your environment. When we talk about the software and hardware specifications, we want to make sure that folks understand where Azure VMware Solution is at the present time. So I think a lot of customers will say, why isn't it 7.0? And the reason being is we're doing this at scale. We're doing this for a number of different customers. So we have as much feature parity as you probably have on premises, right? 6.7 update 3 is sort of the flavor that we've deployed within the AVS clusters. If you look at the far right, that's the hardware specification. So it's one SKU at the present time. And all of the specs that show up there should match up to what you would expect for a hyper-converged server, dedicated server in your environment. The big piece to pay attention to is what shows up at the bottom of the screen here. So there's a minimum of 3 nodes per vSphere cluster. There's a maximum of 12 clusters per private cloud. And there's a maximum of 16 nodes per vSphere cluster. And finally, a maximum of 96 nodes to an Azure private cloud instance. If you're reading that and you're trying to rationalize how big that is, just know that we are really prepared to work with a very large enterprise scale deployment for Azure VMware Solution. And the recommended pattern here is to do a proper assessment. You can do it with Azure Migrate, or you can run something like RV Tools. That'll help you prepare for the amount of nodes that you need within your environment. I also like to talk about this quite a bit because I know at Microsoft, we do a lot of talking points surrounding the shared responsibility model for IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. We've got one now for Azure VMware Solution. And I think the biggest takeaway from here is the idea that if you share that burden of responsibility in terms of operational availability, consistent and uptime, right? Matching all the right uptime for your company, you're seeing that Microsoft is taking over a great chunk of that responsibility for you. So if your hard drive fails at 2 a.m. or the power supply fails at 2 a.m., for some reason, hardware likes to fail at 2 a.m., Microsoft's on the hook for it, right? You're not on the hook to patch your hosts. You're not on the hook to upgrade your hosts. You're not on the hook to sort of maintain the physical infrastructure. That all falls into Microsoft's realm. And you're instead focusing more on configuration of your guest OS workloads. So I've heard of customers bringing configuration management into the mix because they had no time prior to Azure VMware Solution. They can also maybe spend some time and figure out, how to get some of the older OSs transitioned out of the environment. So there are customers who are still running 2008 R2, 2012 R2. This gives them an opportunity to sort of lifecycle management and upgrade those app servers so they're living on newer OSs. So I like this quite a bit when I talk to folks in the broader community, just because of the fact I think it sort of opens up the idea that if you place everything in Azure, it's the same VMware ecosystem you're familiar with, but you're not on the hook for the full stack like you are if you're running it on premises. So in terms of all of my slides, that was what I was prepared to go through today. So let me
That was a good summary of like sort of where responsibilities lie. I
Yeah.
think it's interesting, because I've read, there's this one of these questions around how much does the customer manage of the VMware environment, and I think that was really good to cover off that. A lot of the configuration stuff is still falls into the hands of the customer that's running the environment.
Yeah, you're just not on the hook for dealing with your ESXi hosts. So
Right, and patching things and
right,
all
and
those.
that sort of frees things up quite a bit. So let's do this. So I've got a deployment, and the reason I've got a video versus the actual deployment is it does take a bit of time to deploy. So I have created a deployment video that will walk you through the initial sides of deploying the actual environment inside of Azure, and then connecting it to an Azure VNet. And remember, you also need your ExpressRoute circuit peered into Azure to have that full interconnectivity model. And then you'll enable global reach on top to route traffic from the on-premises environment all the way into the Azure VMware Solution environment. And I think the networking side is always kind of the interesting things. It's not just Azure, right? All of the clouds have interesting network connectivity that they're doing. So it's no different here. So let's go through this. I'll kind of walk through this demo. So, you're looking for the resource like you would any other resource in Azure. and nothing's been deployed in the environment. So you'll click on create. And let's say you went to this screen and you didn't look at any of the prereqs, right? We now have this great spot where if you missed all of that, you can go look at the prereqs. And the major prereqs are you need to be an enterprise agreement customer or a cloud solution provider customer, and you need a valid non-overlapping site or address block. Remember, there's a management network that gets deployed with the Azure VMware Solution environment that's different in theory from your on-premises site or network address block, as well as the Azure VNet that you're peering it into. So you will place it in a resource group. You'll provide the name, and there's no requirements. I think there's like you don't want to go longer than I think it's 16 characters in terms of the name, but it's not like a storage account where it has to be all lowercase. There's only one node, and this is the management IP address range. And I think if I remember, I picked 10.5.0.0/22. It requires a minimum of a /22. You could go up to say /16, /8 if you really wanted to. You also can place tags into the mix here. So a lot of folks get excited about having the ability to query and think through cost management. So you can add tags to these resources as well. And then it's as simple as clicking on review and create. So how much easier is that, right? Think about all the vSphere upgrades that you've been a part of and all of the deployments, much, much more hands-on. And this is just a quick validation. So everything passed. Let's say you misconfigured something. You can always click on previous and reconfigure it, but I've configured everything correctly. So I'm going to hit create. And like I said, this deployment does take some time. So this video speeds it up a bit.
Yep. So just to clarify, we're creating effectively a full VMware environment, an SDC on Microsoft at this point, on the hardware configurations that you showed before.
Correct. Yep. Which is crazy, right? And in a couple of hours, and you've got a full environment. So if you're looking at this, everything on the far right, I didn't do anything with. All the automation that builds the environment, did all the carving up. You know that it worked correctly because it shows up as succeeded. So when you're building this, it says building for a handful of hours. It's now succeeded. So now you need to connect the environment with the express route circuit that gets deployed with your bare metal nodes into Azure. And this is a great new feature. So, this first screen here is where you connect to it, and the virtual network you connect to needs to have a gateway subnet that you've configured. And that allows you to have the express route gateway configured and peered into the VNet. And so I had that configured within this specific VNet, and you click on save, and this kicks off this whole automation where you are building the connection point, the express route gateways, you're linking everything up. And you'd have to do that manually, but that's an awesome automation that you don't have to think through. And then it's fully connected when you go back to connectivity and you look at express route. So in this instance, I have used an authorization key to peer the express route circuit into the Azure VNet. And that's essentially what we call basic interconnectivity. So let me back out of the deployment. And let's go take a look at an environment that's already deployed. I think that's probably the next piece that would be an awesome reality, right? So this is the environment that we have that we've maintained on our team. It's just like everything else, right? You've got all your different little bits that sort of show up here. All these great getting started and tutorials help. They link to the actual documentation. So if you got this far and you didn't look at any documentation, you're not alone. There's documentation you can kind of look into. Now it's just like every other Azure service: activity log, IAM tags, diagnose and solve problems, and locks. So I won't spend any time on that. You don't really need to focus on the Azure VMware Solution specific operations until you get down here to manage. So you'll take a look there and you'll see that we've got the same screen that you saw earlier. I've internet enabled it, so that helps with giving you access over the internet. This helps if you needed to deploy a vWAN. There's all kinds of interesting things you can do with network connectivity. You could even think about an application gateway. You could present some of your web servers with a public IP that could be used and routed because you've allowed the internet to be enabled. And this is the express route circuit that gets deployed with the environment. I was showing somebody how it's very simple to add a brand new key. You just click on request authorization key, and then you just need to redeem that key when you peer it. So that's how the express route service works. And then this is where you configure the public IP. Now, remember I talked about express route global reach. So the full interconnectivity model is to have your own express route circuit on-prem peered into an Azure VNet. And then you've got the express route circuit with Azure VMware Solution. Those need to be connected into an Azure network. Then they hit the Azure backbone. There's no way to route express route traffic east and west until you enable global reach. And it's a feature that normally costs money if you're deploying it outside of Azure VMware Solution. It's a free service, a free add-on if you have Azure VMware Solution. And the reason why that's required is if you want to migrate everything from on-premises all the way into Azure and you want it to be back with an SLA, you want to make sure you've got that global reach configured. So that'll help you because you could have IPsec VPN tunnel connectivity, but VMware wants to guarantee a migration pattern over your own dark fiber.
Mm-hmm. So Shannon, just a comment here because
sure.
So far everything we're doing is through the Azure console. You're sort of like as you get all this set up, you're actually living within the Azure environment. The environment it's an Azure service, so you're sort of like getting it all set up at this
Correct.
point before you operate it, right?
Yes, correct. And then so I'll kind of walk through identity next. So I didn't provision this account. This was provisioned by way of the automation. An admin password gets generated as well, along with this web IP address. Same with NSXT, right? I didn't do anything with configuration. I literally filled out 4 or 5 fields and went through review and create, and all of that got kicked off in the back end. This cloud admin at vSphere.local is very similar to the administrator at vSphere.local. The biggest catch being you don't have access to your ESXi host, which is why it's cloud admin at vSphere.local versus administrator. If you wanted to add additional clusters, you could go in here and edit, and then you could add a cluster, right? There's all kinds of interesting things you could do here. This is all automated via PowerShell, the AZ CLI as well. But I can go up to 4 and hit save, and in about 25 minutes, I'll have another node. I won't talk about the placement policies because that's kind of in preview at the moment. The piece that I want to talk about next here is disaster recovery and HCX. So if you've got Site Recovery Manager, you can deploy that, and you just need a specific license key to enable it. And that works for Azure VMware Solution environments inside of Azure, replicating to another Azure VMware Solution environment inside a different region. You can also think about using it from on-prem into Azure as well. That could be your full-blown DR play. The HCX components are also an add-on, and HCX, and I'm assuming everybody's familiar with it, but it's kind of the Swiss Army knife of migration tooling. You can do a little bit of disaster recovery, but it's really designed for that migration path from on-premises all the way into Azure. And that allows you to vMotion a server from on-premises all the way into Azure. And the idea of vMotion was always one of my favorite topics when I first picked up VMware. The idea you could migrate a VM seamlessly, the same concept exists. And that HCX, what it does is it establishes, it's like an IPsec VPN tunnel. We call it a site pairing. It's almost the same thing. It's ever so slightly different, but it allows that migration path to handle itself over an express route circuit. I won't spend too much time on this because I think what I'll do is do we have enough time for I can log into or we're kind of running close on time, aren't we?
No, we're good.
Okay, so I won't spend too much time on this, but if you are a VMware administrator and you didn't deploy NSX, we expose NSX in the portal. So you can set up segments here, you can set up a DHCP server or a relay, port mirroring, or a DNS zone or an environment. So it's awesome that if you don't have that exposure, but you have a solid VMware environment on premises, you can come into Azure VMware Solution and configure your NSX environment without having a ridiculous amount of background in NSX. So, and I think the big piece next is to kind of go into this. So I've got a jump host. And remember, it's sort of in between IaaS and PaaS. It's not quite IaaS, it's not quite PaaS, but I need something to get into there. So let me grab password. It's a good thing I can't remember it, right? I'm going into an Azure Bastion host. So this has a private IP. It's behind the Azure Bastion, so I don't have to have a public IP exposed. I can go into the VMware environment. Let me go into here. go down to this environment. Let's go to identity. So it's 10.5.0.2. Oh, there we go. Looks just like VMware, right? Cloud admin. Let's paste the password in. And then boom, you've got the environment. It's living inside of Azure. And you'll know it's living inside of Azure because of like the host name, some of the little bits in the environment, you'll notice that it's living inside of Azure. So I wanted to make sure that I covered kind of where you sort of manage the environment, the simplified NSXT components that show up, as well as logging into the environment, because this feels just like vSphere on-prem and you get the same functionality. It's just not living in your data center anymore. It's now living in the Azure ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's been, a theme this month for us, is just having that seamless operability and ability to leverage the same kind of tools and what your team may be familiar with working on-prem, with access to all of the Azure services that are available through the solution. So cool.
Very cool. Any questions in the chat?
No questions in the chat. I think it's a really great demo walking us, and then I love getting into seeing from the vSphere side of it, and how effectively that's where you're going to live now from an ongoing operation standpoint.
Yeah, and I think I've even made the joke that you can almost convince your VMware admins that it's on-prem. It's just that you'll see things like the host name, and then it's like, oh no, that's in Azure.
Absolutely.
Living the Zoom life, because I have someone doing like some big machinery outside my window.
That proves it's live, right?
Perfect. Well, yeah, if anyone has any final questions, please feel free to add those into the chat. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to Shannon directly or to our team. There's also a link to some resources in our YouTube channel in the comments section. So feel free to check that out and take a look at some additional resources that we have on this solution. But otherwise, thank you so much for this demonstration. It was really clear and provided the benefits and sharing what we're able to accomplish with the solution. So I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, it was great. I did have a question, Shannon. I was hoping that might quiet out in front of my window here. But in terms of like what you're seeing with customers, and because a lot of customers kind of that sort of like fall into different camps in terms of some of these solutions that we're partners we're working with are often big, I would assume Microsoft shops, to a large degree, and then looking for sort of the continuation of that within the cloud, and particularly having access to all the Azure services. Are you seeing that with the customers that are sort of looking at this early on?
Yeah, so I think there's a massive market that has not yet seen themselves be 100% cloud or move into the cloud fast enough. I think a lot of customers have sort of struggled with, how do we onboard, maintain hybrid? How do we integrate? And that story is tough if you've got a lot of VMware based infrastructure on premises. So I think what this allows, it allows you to sort of speed up that transformation journey. And then you can think about integrating with different Azure services that you couldn't necessarily integrate with on premises. And the big one I can think of off the top of my head is application gateway. There's no graceful way to really do that if your environment still lives on premises and you're hoping to build out something in Azure, right? That it's going to be a very sort of hard to build solution. So
because you need that network backbone, right?
Correct.
You need that sort of being there.
Yep. So yeah, so we see a lot of customers that are big. They just have a lot of investment in VMware, and they've got a number of engineers that have all of this expertise. And so if they plug their platform into Azure versus embracing, say, IaaS first and then PaaS second, that allows them to upskill at a time that makes more sense for them versus drinking from the funnel of Azure, right? It's definitely a fire hose, and it's hard for folks who are still kind of running day-to-day operations. And so it allows them to sort of kind of pick apart what they want and peel back Azure and understand it better than just, here's all of Azure and, good luck, right?
Absolutely. You can make that transition a little bit smoother and more seamless and prepare the organization from a technology standpoint, but also from a processes and people standpoint.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, it's really nice. It's a really nice solution. I think for a lot of customers, it's a great answer.
Yeah.
All right, I didn't have more. I just was curious what you were saying and with customers.
Sure, makes sense.
It's been fun. It's been good. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, guys. And as we said at the beginning, feel free to check out some of those resources and stay tuned for our next session on Thursday before we take a break next week for VMworld. So if you haven't already registered, make sure you sign up and start building out your agenda. Anyway, thank you again, Shannon. Great to have you, and hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.